A wealthy man disguised himself as a beggar to find a wife in a beauty pageant. Suddenly, a line of beautiful women could be seen in front of a grand television studio in Orlando. Passers-by wondered what all these extravagantly dressed and heavily made-up women were waiting for in front of that gate. Those who stopped to watch could witness the parade of high heels entering the grand studio. These 50 women were preparing to compete in a fierce beauty contest. Each represented an American state, and besides their beautiful appearance, contributed with some cultural knowledge from their region. What none of these women could imagine was that, in addition to competing for the winner's crown, they were also part of an unofficial competition. Ethan, the youngest son of the television network owner, wanted to marry a beautiful woman but had little patience to go out and meet new people. Used to always getting what he wanted, he decided he wanted to marry one of the contestants in the pageant, which would be broadcast by his father's network. However, he didn't want to marry just a beautiful woman. She also had to be uninterested in money. In short, he wanted to marry a beautiful woman, but not one who was only interested in his money. However, Ethan knew that as soon as the women found out who his father was, they would become determined to marry him. The 35-year-old wanted to get married, but didn't want the marriage to happen just for financial interest. Although he never felt that a woman had a sincere interest in him, his father's money was always in the way. While Ethan was preparing to put his plan into action, Emily, the assistant to the producer responsible for organizing the beauty pageant, was busy giving instructions to the 50 women. Emily, 30 years old, was always concerned about her messy hair. She usually went without makeup, and her clothes tended to be wrinkled or shabby. For the competent but disheveled assistant, it was a surprise and an irony to be assigned to work on a beauty pageant. Her job was to guide the contestants and give them the filming schedule. The big night of the pageant was in 2 days, and during that time, they all needed to do some special recordings for the show. These recordings included outdoor scenes, and the next one was scheduled in a park near the network. The idea was for the women, wearing their state sashes, to talk a little about themselves on camera and explain to the judges and the audience why they believe they should be the winners. However, many contestants ignored less attractive women, and Emily tried in vain to make herself heard. In the end, it was the contestants themselves who lost out by not listening to the instructions. If they had paid attention to the messages passed on by the assistant, they would have heard the recommendation to be friendly with the park-goers, as you never know when the camera is filming without notice, and any slip-up could compromise the contestants. However, most of the women were only interested in focusing on the flaws or qualities of the other competitors. Nevertheless, Emily couldn't say that all the contestants were indifferent or treated her badly. Sarah and Lauren were disciplined and very friendly, always paying attention and asking questions to avoid problems. Secretly, or maybe not so secretly, Emily hoped that one of the two would take home the crown. With great effort, Emily managed to get the 50 contestants into the vans that took them to the park. Although the location was close to the network studio, it was important to have motorized transportation. The contestants couldn't get sweaty or too tired, as they needed to perform well in front of the cameras. Ethan enlisted the help of makeup and costume professionals from his father's network to disguise himself as a beggar. The young man's idea was for the women competing in the beauty pageant to see him as a beggar, so he could observe their reactions. The youngest son of the television mogul had to disguise his face a bit with makeup so that he wouldn't be easily recognized, as many people knew him from photos on social media and in celebrity columns in newspapers, magazines, and blogs. Despite the makeup, Ethan still had a handsome face, so by appearance alone, any of the women might like him. However, to look like a beggar, he used some makeup tricks to simulate dirt. The homeless man's outfit was created from costumes used in the network's soap operas. Ethan could feel what actors experience when preparing to portray a character on screen. The filming in the park proceeded as usual for the pageant, which was to say, it was chaotic. Some contestants invented the most baseless reasons to pick on their competitors. In this real-life war, it was up to Emily to become the ambassador of peace. The assistant tried to pacify the contestants, but this was almost an impossible mission. She was busy trying to understand how Madison, one of the contestants, managed to break the zipper of Julia's dress, another competitor with a handbag. This kind of trickery was new to the assistant, who until then had only worked on the production of crime shows for a rival network. Sometimes, the women competing for the beauty crown seemed more dangerous than many infamous criminals. While comforting Julia and trying to contact one of the network's seamstresses, Emily didn't notice a beggar approaching the filming area. Since they were filming in a park, it wasn't possible to keep curious onlookers away, but the producers never imagined that a homeless person would decide to interact with the contestants. Madison, the perpetrator with the handbag zipper destroyer, was the first to notice the ragged man lurking around. Curiously, she even thought he was handsome, but he was a nobody. With deep disdain, Madison pointed at the man and said to Emily, "Look over there, there's a beggar hanging around the filming. Get that thing out of here immediately." Emily, who was already tired of hearing the sound of those women's voices, looked where Madison's finger was pointing. Calmly, Emily took a deep breath and said to Madison, "That man isn't harming anyone, and the park is public, which means he has the same right to be here as we do." In disbelief, Madison continued grumbling, saying she would complain to the show's director. At that moment, Emily questioned what she was doing with her career, knowing she would hear a long lecture from Richard, the show's director. Richard was a middle-aged man who never dated women over 25. Obsessed with his appearance, he had undergone almost every cosmetic procedure available to keep his skin youthful and his look refreshed. However, the result of procedure after procedure was an extremely tight and immobile face. As soon as Madison mentioned Richard, he appeared to check how the outdoor filming was going. The beggar continued to lurk around the filming, but the contestants either ignored him or treated him poorly. When Richard arrived, he didn't even notice the figure that stood out so much from the rest of the people. However, Madison rushed to complain about the beggar's presence to the director. To top it off, she also said that Emily refused to remove that beggar. With an unhappy look, Richard glanced at the assistant and asked why she was dragging her feet. Perhaps she didn't know, but many people wanted her job. Timidly and still trying to fix Julia's dress zipper, Emily responded that she valued the opportunity and didn't do anything because she couldn't remove someone from a public place. Moreover, she pointed out that it was necessary to remember that different media outlets were covering the filming. If they expelled a beggar from there, it would be recorded and on social media in seconds. Knowing that the always disheveled assistant was right, Richard replied to Madison that the best thing to do was to ignore the beggar. Meanwhile, the homeless man, who was actually Ethan in disguise, had already wandered around the entire filming area. He took advantage of the fact that many of the contestants ignored him and listened in on their conversations. For the most part, they talked about trivial matters or criticized their competitors. There wasn't anything interesting to pay attention to. The most relevant conversation he overheard was when the unkempt assistant managed to free herself from her duties and called someone who seemed to be a family member. The woman mentioned that she was very stressed because some of the contestants were undisciplined and made her job difficult. If that wasn't enough, she wanted more free time to dedicate to making a documentary about the lives of animals in big cities. From what Ethan could gather, Emily was a journalist who had always wanted to work in her field, but due to her appearance, she had never had the opportunity. At that moment, the young heir realized that the world could be very unfair to those who didn't fit the standard of beauty. Hearing Emily's witty remarks about the whole situation, he almost found her attractive. Catching himself thinking this, Ethan remembered why he was there disguised as a beggar. He wanted to find his future wife, the woman he would marry and have children with. Being young, handsome, and very wealthy, he couldn't settle for anything less than a stunning woman to be by his side. Even though he recognized the world's injustice toward those who don't fit the standard of beauty, he wasn't the one who would start that revolution. The young man then realized that merely observing the women's reactions to his beggar appearance wasn't enough. He needed them to talk to him. Ethan then approached Vanessa and Sarah, two contestants, asking if one of them could help him with some change to buy bread. Vanessa looked him up and down and then replied, "If you want to eat, go work. A filthy man like you shouldn't even speak to beautiful women like us." Sarah, however, was more sympathetic. She took a $5 bill from the small purse she carried with her and handed it to the beggar. Smiling in an amused way, Sarah asked if the man would really eat or if he wanted the money to drink. Ethan, who was mentally scoring each of the contestants, then thought that maybe Sarah was the ideal future wife. With a grateful smile on his lips, he said he wanted the money to eat. Living on the streets, he had to rely on the kindness of others. Not entirely convinced by his answer, Sarah responded, "My boyfriend always says that even without knowing if it's for drink or food, it's important to help others." As soon as he heard this sentence, Ethan felt his smile fade and then turned his back on that beautiful young woman. He couldn't believe that the most sympathetic of the contestants so far had a boyfriend. But that was to be expected. Beautiful and kind as she was, it would have been strange otherwise. Ethan asked for change from other contestants, but only 2 others gave him a contribution to eat. Many others ignored him and even treated him poorly. When the filming was almost over, Ethan saw Emily sitting in the shade of a tree with a sad expression. Even though he had no interest in that woman, he couldn't resist the urge to talk to her. Still dressed as a beggar, Ethan carefully approached Emily. She was slightly startled when she saw his shadow approaching. The young man braced himself to be snubbed again, this time by a woman who wasn't even beautiful. But to his surprise, the assistant laughed in a rather peculiar way and said, "Sorry for being startled. I thought it was one of the contestants coming to ask me for something impossible. I'm already so tired." Ethan smiled at Emily and replied, "I'm the one who should apologize for scaring you by arriving so quietly." Believing she was in front of a homeless man, the assistant said, "I saw that you were asking the girls from the pageant for money to eat. I imagine they didn't contribute much. I don't have money, but I do have these sandwiches I brought for a snack. If you want, I can give you one of them." Ethan was amazed at this woman's generosity with a complete stranger who had caused her a series of problems. After all, if the contestants had spent the last few hours bothering her, it was because of him. At that moment, he felt a slight shame for what he was doing and considered telling Emily the truth. However, if he did that, he could ruin his plan and fail to choose a contestant to marry. Ethan then sat down next to the production assistant under that tree and ate the sandwich she offered. Moved by the man's situation, Emily thought she might be able to help him a little more. She asked if he wanted to come to her house to take a shower, as she lived with her older brother and could lend the homeless man some clean clothes. He asked if her brother wouldn't be upset with this, and the woman quickly replied that no, he was usually very generous. Besides, he had set aside some clothes for donation some time ago. Ethan accepted the invitation, and after doing so, he wondered why he had agreed to go to that woman's house. Of all the women in that filming, Emily was the last one who would spark his interest, but there he was boarding a bus with that woman. People on public transport gave him dirty looks, but Emily's conversation was so interesting that he didn't even notice those stares. How could a woman so devoid of grace and elegance be so entertaining? When they arrived at Emily's house, Ethan realized that the woman lived in a very simple place. It wasn't an ugly house, but it lacked comfort. Being a television assistant didn't pay much, but even though the house wasn't large or luxurious, it had something special: the affection between Emily and her brother Jason. The young man initially found it strange to see his sister with a homeless person, but then she explained that the man had appeared during the show's filming and needed help. Jason, who was as generous as his sister, helped her welcome the guest. Ethan was able to take a shower and put on one of Jason's clothes, which was going to be donated. During dinner, Jason pondered. He had seen Ethan's face somewhere before. This impression became even stronger after the beggar took a shower and dressed in clean clothes. But where had he seen him? Unable to reach a conclusion, Jason went to bed, as he had to wake up early the next day. Before going to bed, Jason told Emily to settle the man to sleep in the living room and lock her bedroom door. If the guest tried anything, she should scream. Although she knew she shouldn't take strangers into her home, Emily wasn't afraid. She didn't think the beggar would do anything to her, but something felt strange to the woman. When she went to bed, the assistant realized what seemed strange about the situation. Ethan, although dressed as a beggar, didn't act or speak like one. However, this might be because he hadn't always been homeless. Emily could never have imagined that the young man, who seemed so poor in appearance, was the son of the owner. The next day, after having breakfast with Jason, Ethan asked his new friend if he could go with her to the area near the television network. Worried that he would cause more trouble with the pageant contestants, Emily asked what his purpose was in going to that area. Ethan replied that he just wanted to return to the place where he used to ask for help. Jason asked Ethan if he was interested in getting a job. To maintain his disguise, the young man said yes, and Jason promptly responded that he could arrange an interview for him at the factory where he worked to work on the assembly line. It required willingness and attention. Ethan said he would appreciate the opportunity, but that on that specific day, he needed to return to the area where Emily had found him. Sensing the young man's urgency to return to where he had come from, Emily said she would take him, as long as he promised not to ask the pageant contestants for money. Ethan thought he wouldn't ask for money, but maybe he would ask for one of their hands in marriage. It was a shame that Sarah already had a boyfriend. She had shown generosity and was very beautiful. But not all was lost. He could still find out if one of the others had all the desired characteristics. At that moment, Ethan realized that the appearance of any of those contestants with Emily's personality would result in the perfect woman. It was also a pity that the assistant wasn't so beautiful, but looking closely, Ethan shook his head to clear these thoughts from his mind. When Emily saw him make this gesture, she laughed and asked what he was thinking about to have paid so much attention to something so contrary to what normally attracted his attention. Awkwardly, the young man replied that he was just lost in his own dreams. The two took the bus to the network. Along the way, no one looked at Ethan with a dirty look, as he was now clean, all thanks to Emily and her brother's generosity. The two got off at the bus stop near the television network, and she then said goodbye to Ethan, wishing him luck. The woman reminded the young man that her brother had offered him a job opportunity at the factory. Ethan promised he would contact Emily again. As soon as she entered the studio, Emily felt all her peace and tranquility fade away. That documentary project about animals living in the city never seemed so distant. Again, she had to lead the contestants to the park near the network. Some scenes needed to be res-hot because they hadn't turned out well. In part, this was the fault of the contestants who hadn't paid attention to her instructions. While filming the scenes again, Emily saw Ethan approaching the filming. It was impossible that after everything she had done for him, that young man would try to ruin the filming again. As soon as he approached, even better dressed than before, he caused great dissatisfaction among several contestants. Nicole, one of the most beautiful women in the competition, didn't hesitate to complain about being, in her words, harassed by a beggar. Ethan then replied that he wasn't doing anything wrong. After all, the park is public, and he could watch the filming like anyone else. Richard, who had been irritated since the previous day, approached, ready to yell. However, realizing who the young man was, he felt his voice disappear. Ethan, afraid of being exposed, decided to act first and said to Richard, "I'm a beggar, but I have every right to watch the filming in a public place. Just because I'm a beggar doesn't mean I don't have my rights." He emphasized the word beggar so that Richard would understand he shouldn't ruin his disguise. Clever, the director quickly understood that there was something behind this situation. Although dressed as a homeless man, Richard then decided to play along and said in a rude tone, "Really, you beggar, I can't kick you out of a public place, but I hope you behave and don't bother the girls." With a very hammy performance, Richard ended the scene with a not-so-subtle wink. Ethan was irritated, thinking how a director could act so poorly, but still considered that his disguise was safe. Emily, who watched the scene from a distance, found it very strange that Richard had backed down. Normally, that terrible little man would have continued yelling until security removed the beggar. But out of all the possible bad outcomes, this was the least troublesome. If Richard had already accepted that the homeless man would be hanging around, she would have less difficulty controlling the situation. The afternoon of filming passed relatively smoothly. Ethan tried to interact with the participants, but the most he managed was to eat another sandwich. In the shade of a tree with Emily, the woman asked if the beggar would like to sleep at her house again, but this time Ethan said no. Without many explanations, he turned and left. Emily was a little sad and a little irritated by Ethan's indifference. The next day was very busy for Emily. The pageant would be broadcast live that night. In the morning, she had a quick breakfast with Jason and told him everything that happened the day before. Her brother also didn't like to hear that their guest of honor had been dismissive of his sister. When Emily mentioned that despite living on the streets, Ethan didn't behave like someone in need, Jason agreed. It was strange that the young man spoke correctly and was so polite at the table. Emily's brother continued with the strong impression that he knew Ethan from somewhere. Running late, Emily left the house, almost sprinting and without eating her second toast. A little later, Jason took advantage of his day off from the factory to meet his girlfriend, Rachel. The young woman loved hearing the stories from Emily's work that Jason would tell her. This was the closest contact she had with television, and it was exciting. Jason liked to illustrate the stories he told with images from social media. To talk about the pageant his sister was working on, he opened the network's social media accounts. As he scrolled through the images, he came across a photo of the network owner's heirs. At first, Jason thought he was seeing things, but then he realized he was right. He really had seen Ethan before. Ethan's face was familiar because he always visited the network's social media profiles to talk about the daily life of television with Rachel. That's how he saw Ethan's face. But now he needed to find out why that rich kid pretended to be a beggar and took shelter in a poor assistant's house. Without telling Rachel that he and his sister had sheltered the television network's heir in their home, Jason decided he needed to tell his sister. He took a screenshot of Ethan's photo and sent it to Emily. Busy breaking up a fight between two contestants twice her size, Emily didn't see her brother's message. All that chaos only got worse as the pageant's start time approached. Emily could only think that if she hadn't gone crazy by then, she wouldn't go crazy anymore. The pageant began airing at 10 p.m. sharp. The elimination rounds were held, and with each elimination, Emily had to prepare to break up fights between the eliminated contestants and those who remained. Many who were eliminated wanted to attack those who stayed, trying to ruin their clothes and hairstyles. Sarah and Lauren, the two contestants who were kind to Emily, remained in the competition, and it was inevitable that she rooted for one of them. However, Madison, who also remained in the competition, was a strong contender to beat. When only the final 3 contestants were left, it was announced that one of the television network's heirs would take the stage to announce the big prizes of the competition. When Ethan walked across the stage, wearing a beautiful, well-tailored suit, he surprised many who had seen him as a beggar. Initially, Madison didn't recognize him as the homeless man she had treated poorly, but upon observing the surprise on Sarah and Lauren's faces, even she realized. Amused by the surprise in the audience's eyes, Ethan flashed a wide smile and said, "My name is Ethan, and in the last 2 days, I've been living with the contestants without properly introducing myself to them." Emily, who was watching the show from backstage, couldn't believe that the simple, poorly dressed young man who had slept in her house was actually the heir to that television network. Believing it was part of the competition, she wasn't even angry about Ethan's lie. The young man told the audience that he had disguised himself as a beggar to get to know the contestants better and was surprised by the generosity of some of them. He continued saying, "However, unfortunately, the world is still driven by appearances, and not everyone values people for who they are, but only for the clothes they wear." Without further ado, Ethan announced that the winner would receive a cash prize, a brand new car, and a scholarship to a university course of her choice. These were excellent prizes, and one of those 3 young women would win them. Then the presenters announced that Lauren had come in 3rd place. So, the winner would be either Madison or Sarah. Emily found it strange that Madison was in the final. Despite being very beautiful, she was one of the contestants who had treated Ethan the worst while thinking he was a beggar. How could she have scored so well to make it to the final? Emily began to think that maybe Ethan's speech was a big lie. Even though he had said it was terrible for people to judge others by their appearance, he didn't remove Madison from the final. After a long commercial break, it was time to announce the Beauty Pageant's grand champion. Everyone eagerly awaited to see which of the 2 women would take home the crown and all those prizes. Emily smiled when she heard the presenters shout together that Sarah was the grand winner. The young woman, who had always been kind to everyone on the show, was crowned the most beautiful in the pageant. Madison tried to hide her sadness and anger. Then Emily saw Ethan approach the runner-up and say something to her. The young woman smiled and nodded. It didn't take long for Emily to learn that Ethan had asked Madison out. Backstage, the talk was that he wanted to marry and was looking for a beautiful wife. Since Sarah, the winner, was already taken, he decided to try something with the runner-up. At that moment, Emily was very disappointed. She could only think about how shallow and deceitful Ethan was. If he had disguised himself as a beggar to find out how the contestants were beyond their appearance, why was he asking the worst of them out? At least the pageant was over, and she could finally be reassigned to another project at the network. That was what she hoped for. Losing that job wasn't an option. As she was leaving the network to catch her bus, Emily saw Ethan talking intimately with Madison. The young man saw the assistant leaving and thought he would like to say goodbye to her. He ran towards Emily, who quickened her pace to avoid the conversation. Ethan started shouting for her to wait. She then turned and asked what he wanted. Realizing she was angry, he apologized for pretending to be a beggar. Emily looked him in the eye and then said, "I don't care about your poor performance as a beggar. What I can't understand is your speech being so disconnected from reality." He looked at her without understanding why she was being so harsh. The assistant then nodded towards Madison. Ethan understood what she was trying to say and began to justify the unjustifiable. He said, "I realize that, unfortunately, I'm not going to find everything I'm looking for in one woman. So, I decided to let myself be guided by beauty. Maybe it's a mistake to go out with Madison, but she's really a very beautiful woman." Emily said, "So you didn't learn anything from your experience as a beggar?" and walked away. In the following weeks, Ethan started dating Madison, but even her beauty didn't make him happy. The young woman spent all her time bad-mouthing Sarah and complaining about coming in second place. When she started on this topic, Ethan thought about the conversations he had with Emily under the tree, eating sandwiches, or at the assistant's house. He did everything he could to reassign Emily to the network's journalism department. Even though she judged him so harshly for his choices, he wanted her to have good job opportunities. From the information he received, Ethan learned that Emily was doing very well. After several attempts to muster the courage to go after her and talk, Ethan finally went to the department where she was working. Watching her from a distance, he realized that even though she didn't have the standard beauty of the pageant contestants, Emily was very attractive. That's when he understood that it had always been the disheveled assistant he wanted. That day, he didn't speak to Emily. He ran out and called Madison to talk. The young woman was excited, believing she was about to be proposed to. However, he broke up with her, saying they were too different. Madison was left baffled. Then he went back to Emily and, with 2 sandwiches in a bag, asked if she would have lunch with him under a tree. Confused but curious, the woman agreed. During this conversation, he asked if they could go out to get to know each other better. After a pause that seemed very long, Emily said yes, but that besides needing to earn her trust, he would also have to gain Jason's forgiveness. Worried, he asked if Emily's brother was angry, and she then said, laughing, that it was just a joke. Her brother found it amusing to see a rich heir trying to pretend to be a beggar. Ethan learned that he had also acted wrongly by judging only by appearance, and that, in the end, he had behaved like the contestants who had looked down on him for being dressed as a beggar. I hope you enjoyed this story full of twists and turns. If you liked it and want more exciting stories like this, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Here, every story is a new adventure, and we're always ready to surprise you. Also, leave your comment about what you thought of the story and suggestions for future narratives.